So we're going to continue our series looking into our 275th history and the parishioners who have been instrumental in it. As you remember, our approach is not simply to look at what our parishioners did, but to put them in a wider context. And we're going to look today at 1776 and the American Revolution. And we're going to look at people as they were at that time, struggling to understand what was going on, having to battle their own limitations of knowledge, and looking at their motivations and choices. And we hopefully will then be thinking about how we fit into this story, perhaps not simply as Americans, but as sort of Anglicans struggling with some of the issues that 1776 produced for members of his church at that time. Greg Kalis, who may be familiar to some of you, but perhaps Greg would like to say a few words about how you fit into the story.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Hi, I'm Greg Kalis. I'm a historian. I currently work at Towson University. My primary expertise is in 20th century U.S. popular culture, so I'm swimming out of my normal seas here. But in any event, I'm glad to, and I think I'll be starting off talking a little bit about a general picture of the Revolutionary era, and maybe starting to get into how the parishioners of St. James fit or don't fit into some broader patterns in both Pennsylvania and the nation at large.
Thanks, Greg. And then I will be talking about St. James in particular, especially in the Anglican Church, and how it's adapting or not adapting to the events of the 1870s and 1770s and 1780s. And then hopefully we'll have some time to talk about how the Episcopal Church comes into being at the end of this period. But we may run out of time by then. So hopefully we'll get back to that later in the fall. So thank you. Thank you, Greg.
Okay, I'm going to begin. I'm going to pull up the dramatic entrance. I'm going to put up my stopwatch here so that I can make sure I'm staying on track with time, because we want to make sure we have time for question and answers. But I want to begin, actually, with a quick look at sort of a map here that shows what the colonies were like in 1750. And one of the things I find striking about this map is just how sort of A, unorganized it is, and B, how little the British had control of in 1750, how sort of disorganized. We have that huge swath of purple, which is French influence. We have Spanish presence for a long time. And we have to come to terms with the fact that between this period in 1750 and by the time we get to 1783, there will be an entire nation that is carved out of this, well-defined, that is broken free from Britain. And some big things have had to happen to make that happen. And where does St. James fit in that story? That's some of what I want to get to. So, why revolution? And here, let me indulge myself as a sort of teacher and ask, in one sentence, if anyone wants to volunteer, what do we remember about why the colonies revolted against the British? What's one sentence that might help explain this? If you just shout it out, if you got a big voice, is that it?
No longer wanted to be under the authority of the king.
Great, no longer want to be under the authority of the king. Tim?
A lack of respect for Englishmen living here who felt they were English.
Okay, so a lack of respect for Englishmen, their rights. Kathy?
Taxes.
Taxes. Taxation without representation. Let's just do one more, and then I want to jump on anything else that we haven't gotten to yet. What? Tyranny. Okay, the idea of tyranny. Yeah, is that what you were going to say? Freedom to make your own cause, right? Freedom to make your own decisions. Laws. Okay, make your own decisions in life. Great. And I think, generally speaking, we're getting at the idea that there's sort of two principal explanations or general ideas that people have had about this over the years. One is a kind of ideological one that a number of you have spoken to, right? This idea of the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This comes from the Enlightenment, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. A new sense of what government's responsibilities are to people and their sort of rights to demand that government take care of them in some ways and respond to their needs. The other one is, I can't remember who said this off the top of my head, but But this economic one, right? Yeah, as I say here, no one likes to pay taxes, and that sense of an economic disconnect. And as I put it here, that the colony's economic system had developed beyond British control. And sometimes I think there can be a sort of overly simplistic take on this, which is that one argues one and not the other, but of course the truth is somewhere in between these two principal things, this ideological and economic issue. And I think, as we look at St. James, we can see that both of these come together in this space, and that's what's in part interesting to me. So, and here, I can't believe how much time I've already used. Okay, we'll do this very quickly. So, if we think about, we look at the map in 1763, it starts to look a little bit more familiar, right? A little more recognizable. So that by 1763, we've got our colonies now sort of more defined. The British have wrested firmer control of this. This is after what's sometimes referred to as the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, where the French had essentially been booted out as a result of conflict here, and now it's more recognizable to where we know. And this moment, though, helps to create the seedbeds for revolution, though, in a whole lot of ways. Because in order for the British to kick the French out, they spend a lot of money and lose a fair number of lives in the process. And at that point, the British government had sort of been letting the colonies develop, create their own governments, create their own economic systems. The British suddenly decide, hey, wait a minute, we need to pay ourselves back for all this investment that we've made. And this begins the process of the British, again, I'm going to do the very 30,000-foot view, but the British attempting to impose new taxes, to tighten the economic screws, to get money back from the colonies. And this is where, for the people who make that economic argument, you can start to see those effects take shape. As the British start to try and impose those taxes, how do the colonists feel about this? They don't like it very much at all, because as I said in my slide previously, no one likes to pay taxes. In particular, no one likes to pay more taxes. So there begins to be some resistance that emerges from this. And here we can see this, and this comes back, I think, to Tim's comment about rights as British citizens. Here we have a nice quote from a Boston town meeting about these new taxes. And one of the things I think is striking here, this we apprehend annihilates our charter right to govern and tax ourselves. It strikes at our British privileges we hold in common with our fellow subjects who are natives of Britain. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without having legal representation, there's that taxation without representation issue we talked about, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves? So taxes creating a kind of animosity here. Note, by the way, that they recognize that being slaves is a bad thing here, right? It is an equation they don't want to be a part of. So there's a kind of tragic irony that we don't follow through fully on that with independence and the Constitution, but that's a subject for another time. But this idea here, people upset, resistant, and this spills out into a variety of events. And here I'm just checking my time. Oh, Lord. Okay, so many of you be familiar with this. From the Boston Tea Party, protesting essentially the British government trying to force the colonists to buy one sort of licensed brand of tea, if you will, which leads to a series of restrictive policies by the government, spills out into the First Continental Congress, and the first battles of the war, the Second Continental Congress. Again, sorry for rushing through this, but for time purposes, I think what's interesting is by the time we get to the Second Continental Congress, we have an open state of rebellion. Right? The United States has broken free here. And the question is, where does Lancaster fit in all of this? Or more generally, one of the things that I think is interesting is, as they make this claim, by the way, the Declaration of Independence, this is where that ideological stuff comes into being. We can hear the role of the Enlightenment. This John Locke, people like that, who are expressing new ideas about the rights of individuals, but also the proper relationship of government. And one of the reasons I'm calling attention to this famous passage from Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, we get this Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That is, the people who are being governed have to agree to give up their rights, have to agree to be ruled by the government. And that when the government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of people to alter or abolish it. This is a revolutionary idea at the time. And if we think about it, and I think just to tease maybe some of what Cordelio talked about, to think about this in relation to British society, which is fundamentally extremely hierarchical, where there was a sense of a superior and an inferior, and below that an inferior, right? A very strict series of hierarchical relationships that doesn't involve questioning or changing the rules, right? It involves sort of staying true to those sort of principles. So this is potentially very earth-shattering. And for our Anglican rectors and others, this is going to be a kind of tricky thing to navigate, right? That they are moving from a hierarchical, very well-defined society into something much more nebulous. And not everybody, it's not just Anglican ministers who struggle with this. Lots of people are unsure. And just to give you a sense of this, historians estimate, and these are imperfect numbers, of course, but historians estimate that about 40 to 45% of the white colonists are patriots, roughly. They estimate that about 15 to 20% of the white colonists were loyalists. So that's a pretty significant number. Maybe 1 in 5 are loyalists, right? They don't side with the patriot cause. The rest of the population was sort of neutral or uncommitted. They are the Aaron Burrs, if you will, of that time, waiting to see which way the wind will blow, waiting to see which side they're going to jump on board with. And if we get a little tighter here, in Pennsylvania, and here I'm going to simplify what is a very complicated story, and other people maybe can fill this in the Q&A. In Pennsylvania, prior to the time of the Continental Congresses, most of the established power in Pennsylvania had sort of pro-loyalist tendencies. That's because the Penn family, the Quakers who had founded the colony, had deep ties to the king. The king had granted them the charter for the creation of this colony. They were a minority in terms of the shape of the state, and therefore their power really came from the king, not that much from the will of the broader people. So there's a kind of interesting tension that's emerged. We'll hear in a moment here, almost every Anglican rector sided with the Loyalists, with one exception. So we'll hear who that one exception is in a moment. Where do our patriots come in? Well, our patriots come in part because with the Continental Congress, one of the things that comes out of it is a commission to change the Pennsylvania state government. The Continental Congress sort of encourages and almost requires a new constitution for Pennsylvania to join in the common cause of the revolution, and that puts more patriot-leaning people into positions of power. It kicks out some of those loyalists, some of those old ties here. Who were the patriots? Patriots tended to be younger. They also tended to be people who had earned success in the growing market economy. So these are people who had created their economic foundation in this state and didn't feel any sense of obligation to the king as a result. They had made their own way. What did they owe this king who was thousands of miles away? It didn't make sense to them. Lancaster residents are known for being some of the most fervent pro-revolutionary people in Pennsylvania. And I think there's a lot of why that is. Irish and Scots-Irish heritage, I think, is a possible explanation. These are people who felt colonized by the English, so therefore a chance to break away from the English seems pretty darn good. We also have a lot of German speakers, of course, in Lancaster County. They feel almost no loyalty to the English king, certainly, so they're going to be more likely to side with revolution. And if we look at some of the leaders in the revolutionary movement here, about four of the top 12 or 13 come from the German branches, Lutheran and Reformed, and the remainder are either Anglican and Presbyterian. And am I correct in saying that most Presbyterians were sort of Scottish? Is that correct? Okay. I was raised Catholic. Protestantism is I can't understand it. So anyway, I'm still in that point. But anyway, okay, that was what I thought. All right. So, and here's my last thing before I turn it over to Cordelia. Sorry, Cordelia, I've gone over time. Okay, my last thing I'll mention is if we look at some of our notable St. James patriots here, they fit some of these patterns. And I won't spotlight everybody, but let's take a look, for example, at Matthias Kit, related to you? No? Anyway, here's a proprietor of the White Swan Tavern. Here's a middling sort of business owner, right? He is not a landed elite. He doesn't have that kind of status, right? He's somebody who's made a name for himself in this area, therefore not especially connected to the king and to that sort of broader sense, right? He fits right into that pattern I mentioned. We look at Edward Hand, one of our most famous St. James parishioners. He is an Irish immigrant who's come to the United States. Again, think about how that might make him more likely to support revolution. And he becomes such a supporter that he becomes a general in the Patriot Army, right? So those patterns, there's an economic tie, there's also an ideological tie. They're wrapped up in this story. I'm going to end it there. Amelia, it's all you.
Thank you, Greg. That's really helpful to get the wider context in which we're looking at St. James. I also want to look at a wider context before we actually dive directly into St. James, and that is looking at what the Anglican Church looked like in the colonies before 1776. And as you know, it wasn't called the Episcopal Church, it was called the Church of England. And if you'd be coming to St. James in the 1770s, you'd come to services based on the Book of Common Prayer, which had been passed by the British Parliament in 1662. You would be baptised with the services in there, married, and then you'd worship with those services, usually just morning and evening prayer, because communion was a very irregular occurrence in these periods. If you were also unlikely to have been confirmed, and that's another reason why communion was very infrequent in this part of the time and country. And of course the reason for that was there were no bishops, and we can come to that issue later. But so all members of the Church of England would have been using the Book of Common Prayer on a Sunday morning. But there, the similarities between people's experiences across the colonies would have varied. There wasn't a standard way of being the Church of England in the 13 colonies. If you were in southern colonies, the Church of England was, in quotes, the established church and received legal and financial benefits from the governments in those colonies. If you were in the New England area, the established churches were the Congregationalists, and so you were sort of a social minority and also didn't get the financial benefits of being an Anglican in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And then there was all the people like us in the middle who weren't part of an established church, but we got special privileges through the original Pennsylvania Charter, which allowed citizens to request to have an Anglican clergyman if there were 20 or so families in the neighbourhood who might be able to use their services. So very different experiences of what being an Anglican meant and the social consequences thereof. But what is generally true is that most Anglicans at this time tended to be wealthy people, influential people. Churches didn't pay for themselves like now, and churches had to be funded by things like pew rent, and that tended to encourage people with more money to literally be invested in their church. How churches got around this problem who didn't have money to fund clergy was they were reliant on the support of a missionary organisation called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. I think I've got all those words in the right order. A British missionary organisation whose remit was to send clergy to the New World to support British citizens, subjects as we should say at this time, and still, but also to try and Christianise the native population. The Anglican Church at this time isn't a national organisation in the colonies. There are no dioceses and there are no national institutions. There's no general convention. All the links are back to England. If you're going to be ordained, you have to be ordained by a bishop. And there's no bishop in the colonies. There's a bishop who has this responsibility sitting in London. So every clergyman, and I use that word deliberately, has to make the journey back to London to be ordained. And historians have looked at the numbers of people who did that, and there's a calculation that about 1 in 5 of them didn't actually make it back to London. Shipwrecks and things like smallpox got in the way of their return. So a very high mortality rate, I think, really for a professional qualification. I said there were no bishops in the colonies, and that wasn't necessarily because members of the Church of England here didn't want bishops. A lot of them did. But it was a very contentious issue. And you'll understand this in the light of what Greg has said. There was a real religious fear of having bishops. If you weren't a member of the Church of England, often you'd come to this country fleeing what you considered persecution in England, and bishops were one of the tools of that. If you weren't conforming to the Church of England in England, there were legal penalties for that, so that's why the Puritans came here. There was also a huge political fear, because bishops in England not only have spiritual power, they had political power. They were members of Parliament, and they sat in the House of Lords, and they were important political figures. And as Greg is saying, there was this political gap between the colonies and Britain, and the bishops were not seen as part of the great solution to it. And then if you were a layperson, especially if you were very influential, you were funding your church, you were calling the shots, you didn't want a bishop coming in and upsetting your little church. So there were Anglicans who were very passionately against having bishops, as well as non-Anglicans. So the revolution arrives in 1776, and it's been said that the Church of England was the most divided church on this issue out of all the churches in the colonies. Research has been done on Christ Church, Philadelphia, looking at what the pew owners of that time thought, and it's reckoned about 49% of them were patriots and 41% were loyalists. You'll remember that some of the most important founding fathers were members of Christ Church, Philadelphia. Also, 3/4 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Anglicans as well: Washington, Henry, Hamilton, and Jay. We may disagree how much Anglican they really were in the light of our own theology at St. James at 2019, but we can talk about that on another time. But having said that, loyalism definitely had a very Anglican tinge to it. And not surprisingly, when people are praying and worshipping in a church that's looking back to Britain, when you have clergy that are ordained in Britain and formed there, and when these clergy actually take vows, which include a vow of allegiance to the British sovereign as head of the Church of England, a vow which our own rector had to take, and then get a waiver from the State Department saying, maybe not, we can revisit this, whether you can make yourself an expatriate or not at some other date. And they also promised to use the Book of Common Prayer, and not an edited version that they felt like saying, but what actually was in the Book of Common Prayer. And as you know, there were prayers in there for the King and Parliament and the royal family. I've also mentioned that the Society of Propagation of Gospel Clergy not only came from England, but they were financially dependent on that organisation. Their economic ties were back overseas, they weren't to the people sitting in the pews. But all Anglicans had to make choices at this time, and as Greg has said, it was determined by economics, politics, social context, often also by the presence of military forces. That can sort of concentrate the mind if you were living in New York or Philadelphia at certain periods of the revolutionary era. But I think the choice was really hardest for the clergy. Probably I shouldn't say that, and not my natural sympathies perhaps, but and I want to talk about two clergy in particular, Thomas Barton and Charles Inglis. These were men who believed they were doing their Christian duty in resisting wrongful and sinful actions that were contrary to their faith, and in particular to biblical teaching. you may remember reading in St. Paul that Christians have a duty to obey civil authority. And that was a really big burden for these people. And the cost of this discipleship was very high for both of them, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I think it's really important to realise that this wasn't just a military issue, a philosophical contest and battle, but had real consequences for people, quite ordinary people, had to make painful decisions and suffered accordingly, and were members of our church. So Thomas Barton was rector here from 1759. His first wife, Esther Rittenhouse, came from what proved to be a great patriotic family. She died in 1774. And Barton continued ministering here until 1776. The last time he actually sat was in front.
You want to put the image in?
Yes, sorry. Sorry, what do I need to press?
Push the space bar on the laptop.
Sorry, space on that.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's Barton, which is a very familiar picture. This is Inglis, we'll talk about in a little while. So he is faithful through the 74 to 75 period when things are obviously beginning to heat up and committees are being formed and the dividing lines are becoming clear. And the last time he actually serves in this church is in June 23rd, 1776. And the church is closed after that. And he says it's to avoid the fury of the populace who would not suffer the liturgy to be used unless the collects and prayers for the king and the royal family were omitted. So it's a very fundamental issue for him. He can't stand up there saying the prayers that he has always been instructed to say and believes in with a hostile congregation, shall we say. And a lot of clergy at this time are closing their churches or leaving. The pressure is becoming greater. Some of them are sort of saying the prayers with their fingers crossed. But there's more and more pressure coming because Continental Congress is demanding days of fasting and prayer for the patriot cause. And so what is a clergyman supposed to do? And so public worship in lots of places is just vanishing. And our church is actually boarded up in 1778. With the nails, ironically, bought by Barton's son-in-law, Paul Zatzinger, who I'm very interested in learning more about. Kind of been an easy role as son-in-law at this point, trying to protect your family and do the right thing. So Barton's got no public ministry at this point, but he does keep on, to some extent, having a private ministry. We know that he's visiting the sick, but baptisms are still happening in people's homes. He has no money because money's been cut off from SPG, so he's dependent on offerings from the congregation. He obviously doesn't have a great impression of Lancaster at this point. It's very interesting reading his letters because he was also the rector at Bangor and Peckway. He talks much more about their generosity, and he actually moves his family out of Lancaster to be in those areas. So he obviously feels they're safer and more supported there. At this time, other people are talking about the threats they're experiencing, and Barton is writing this back to England, telling about local clergy here who are being beaten up, who are being insulted, being thrown in rivers. All those sort of things are going on. And that's why clergy in Pennsylvania basically disappear, with the one exception, who is William White, who has become chaplain to the Continental Congress and is going around with them both in Philadelphia and in York, and they moves there. So Barton is sort of scrabbling around trying to survive from 1776 for another couple of years, but increasingly oaths are used, oaths of allegiance, to separate the sheep from the goats, shall we say, and he's going to be forced to make a declaration of obedience and allegiance to the new governments that are appearing. he gets permission to leave this area, and he goes to New York, which is a loyalist stronghold for most of this period, and he spends a couple of years there with other loyalists. Obviously, it's a very hard life, and he dies there 2 years after arriving. He's separated from his family, and he has no property other than the property that he has managed to sign into the name of his son-in-law, Paul Zatzinger. So he's working to keep the family intact back here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So how typical is Barton? Well, Pennsylvania is seen as a sea of ardent patriots with these isolated clergy. And as I say, they are all loyalists without one exception. Most of them are loyalists in a sort of quiet way. They're not making any trouble, if we like, with one exception, which is the rector at York, who tries to disrupt the supply lines around ammunition and revolution, and is imprisoned some time for his efforts. So in the early 77s, we've got 19 congregations in Pennsylvania with about 1,500 members of the church, we think. As I say, by 1783, there's only one. And looking at this more nationally, there's been a survey that about 80% of clergy in New England area and New Jersey and New York are loyalists. But when you look at the four southern colonies, only about 23% are. And a lot of that is to do with the economics and relationships, both locally and nationally and regionally. So Barton comes to quite a sad end, separated from his family, poor and obviously in ill health. Charles Inglis is an interesting example. It might not be a name that's familiar to many of you. He comes from a clergy family in Ireland. He emigrates to Pennsylvania in 1754, and he comes here to teach, actually in Lancaster, at a free school to instruct children of German Pennsylvanians. This is a very strategic school, shall we say. The idea, and it's funded by SPG, is that if you teach English to the German population, they will be more loyal to the British in general, as well as having their lives improved in other spiritual ways, I'm sure. He has to go back to England, and he is ordained there. He then comes back, and after a brief stint in Delaware, he moves to Trinity Church in New York as associate rector. Unlike Barton, he's a great campaigner and polemicist. He's arguing for having resident bishops before the revolution, and so he makes a name for himself as very unpopular with a lot of people who, as I say, see bishops as a bad idea. But as the political discussions around independence and rights heat up, he joins with other clergy to actually form an organisation to sort of the rebuttal unit, if you like, of the Church of England in New York, along with Samuel Seabury, who's going to be a future bishop. And so Inglis writes lots and lots of letters and papers, and he writes pamphlets explaining why this whole revolution idea is really a really bad idea from a Christian perspective, but also from a political perspective. Not surprisingly, he ends up on the wanted list. There's an act of attainder that's passed by the New York Assembly in 1779, declaring him guilty of high treason and confiscating all his property. So then he's dependent on charity as well. But luckily he's in New York, which is, as I say, largely a loyalist stronghold. But the inevitable happens, the victory of the American colonists happens, and the peace agreement is signed in 1783, which is obviously a bitter blow for people who have argued and fought against independence. But
what's so interesting about Inglis, which I didn't realise until I did some more work on it, I thought he was going to leave a sort of bitter and angry man having lost his cause, but he somehow seems to be able to find a way of seeing the bigger picture, of recognising reality and wanting to be involved in reconciliation. His last sermon before New York is evacuated, in that he says, "Be perfect, be of good comfort, be of one mind, live in peace. The God of love and peace shall be with you." And he comes back to Britain and eventually is made Bishop of Nova Scotia, becoming the first bishop outside the British Empire, in the British Empire, but outside the British Isles. So that's the experience of a lot of the clergy in general, but not all clergy. If you were in the South, your experience was very different. You kept your church open, you prayed for and preached on the revolution. You had a different moral issue, was what about what it says in Paul's letter to the Romans? How can you override Scripture? And of course, the way people thought was, that civil authority is only legitimate civil authority. That's the only authority you have to obey. So that's how they squared their particular circle. Other people, as so often in political conflict around the church, say it's not really a church issue at all, we just keep our heads down, we're spiritual people, we don't have to engage in the muck of politics and real life. And that was also a strain in the South. I know time is not on my side, but I just quickly want to say, after this, obviously, Church of England is finished in this country and needs to evolve into something else. And this is where William White is so crucial. He's a pragmatist. He's able to work with both sides, the loyalists, the former loyalists and the former patriots. He's able to adapt the tradition of Anglicanism, which people wanted, the worship and the hierarchy to some extent, and the liturgy and all those sorts of things, while at the same time taking on board the great political and social shift that has obviously happened in this country, and really wants his model of the Episcopal Church is that it's a much more lay-run organisation than its counterpart in the Church of England. So that's where we get General Convention, different houses, the lay voices are really incorporated into the revised Episcopal Church. He does bring back bishops. I won't tell you how that happens. It makes Brexit look simple. So if you want to while away a couple of hours of your life understanding how bishops come back to, or actually come to the Episcopal Church, that's a very good way to do it. But he retains the Book of Common Prayer with obvious adaptations, removing all the royalist and British stuff.